Well, welcome to Christ and Culture. This is Pastor Jeff Short, and today we're going to be talking further about I call it the collapse of the Christian social conservative majority on the Supreme Court, with the latest decisions by the Supreme Court led by Neil Gorsuch, who was supposedly the social conservative solid Supreme Court justice, but as we've seen in the last week or two, he has written an opinion on a 1964 civil rights case legislation that totally rewrites it. And so he is no longer a conservative or an original intent judge for all intents and purposes. He is now part of the activist liberal side of the court. Now, some people may say, no, that's not right. You're mischaracterizing him. Well, I base my opinion on his recent court case. And so where he did, in fact, rewrite the law in 1964, and we'll explain that here in a post. I would like to share a post of the New York Post that has a good presentation on this situation, and they raise the same issues that I raise, basically, what's going on with Neil Gorsuch. So let's jump into that article, and I'll bring it up here. It's out of the New York Post, and we're going to read and find out whether, in fact, it is the case that Neil Gorsuch is actually flipping liberal, which I say that he is. Now, maybe he always was liberal, but we thought he was conservative because we were told by the Federalist Society that the list that they gave President Trump in 2016 was a legitimate, solid, conservative justice list. And lo and behold, it was not. It was not. So let's jump into this. Now, this means something to Christians because we've been trying to reverse this secular, humanistic slide downward that we've seen in the last 50 years. Starting, for example, with Roe v. Wade decision in 1973, legalizing abortion in all 50 states. We've been trying to reverse that, and we've been trying to put judges on the court that would interpret the Constitution as it is written, not as they would like to see it written. And so in 1973, the Supreme Court majority rewrote the whole section on the Constitution that basically opens the door for abortion. If you let the Constitution stand, you have to go through the legislation to get an abortion result. But the Supreme Court jumped ahead and rewrote the Constitution, evidently, and reinterpreted at least to allow for abortion. Well, we're seeing the same thing here with Neil Gorsuch, and it's a very disappointing situation for Christians, especially because we supported this man. We supported Trump's pick of him. And we just like we supported Judge Brett Kavanaugh last year. And so we're very disappointed. But let's read this article and let me explain commentary while we go through it. It says, Neil Gorsuch slapped conservatives by creating a new gay rights. Okay, that's very appropriate. That exactly describes the situations. As Christian conservatives, we counted on this man to be a solid pick. We counted on him to be a solid vote for sanity on the Constitution and law level. We counted on him to not write laws, but to interpret the law. And we were counting on him heavily in the so-called majority conservatives now. As we see, they're not so conservative anyway. So here's Neil Gorsuch being sworn in by the Justice Anthony Kennedy, who unfortunately was supposed to be a conservative also, appointed by a conservative Republican president. And if he had stayed true to the expectations we had of him, we probably wouldn't have Roe v. Wade right now, and we would have abortion restrictions, the stopping of the killing of millions of babies. But like Gorsuch now, Kennedy flip-flopped, and so he's also being followed by Gorsuch, and we might even be surprised there might be some more flip-flops on the court. But This is very frustrating for Christians because we pray about this, we work about this. This is one of the main reasons why we choose presidents, so they can appoint judges. But if they're going to appoint men who then turn traitor and betray the constituency that put them there, we're in trouble. Okay, so let's read on. The Roe v. Wade of religious liberty arrived Monday, and it was delivered by the putatively conservative Justice Neil Gorsuch, tapped in 2017 by Team Trump to replace the late Antonin Scalia. Chief Justice John Roberts tagged along, making a 6-justice majority that included the High Court's liberals. The decision epitomizes the legal conservative movement's sad sack failure to deliver for conservatives. So this article is actually indicting the legal conservative movement's failure to produce results. In other words, okay, we have had abortion for over 40 years here in the United States. We have had presidents, conservative presidents, elected in office for 4 years, 8 years, appointing so-called conservative judges to the court. And what is the result? We still have abortion on demand. We still have Roe v. Wade as the law of the land, and we can't get rid of it. And it doesn't seem to be helping it, even by these conservative think tank institutions like the Federalist Society giving us a list of qualified candidates. And so Trump picks one of those candidates, and here he is, Neil Gorsuch, and he betrays the conservatives on this big, big issue. Very disappointing. In Bostock versus Clayton County, the majority informed us that the interpretation of Title VII of this 1964 Civil Rights Act, held unchallenged between its enactment and the year 2017, was in fact erroneous. The statute's prohibition against employment discrimination on the basis of sex, Gorsuch told us, extends to sexual orientation and gender identity. This isn't textualism. It's ivory tower liberalism, and this article is so right. And this is written by Josh Hammer in the New York Post, and he's exactly right. It's not textualism. Textualism is supposed to be an in-house theory among originalists. An originalist is someone who believes that when you interpret a text, like the Constitution, like laws, you have to go to the original intent of the framers or the authors of the text to decide what the text means. And then you let the original intent stand, and you tell people, for example, if they want to change the law, they need to pass laws that change the law. But the court is not supposed to be involved in crafting law and policy. It's not involved in legislating from the bench. It's supposed to simply be an umpire, and it says, okay, this is what the text says, this is what you have to deal with. If you don't like that text, change it. If you don't like the Constitution, amend it. If you don't like this civil rights code, change it through Congress, through legitimate means. We have a process for that to be done. Now, the activist judges, they say, no, we go in and we fudge with the law. We actually rewrite the law. We change the law. We bring out totally new and novel meanings to the law. Whatever we feel on the bench is where society is right now. So they're not actually just interpreting the law or the Constitution, whatever the case may be, in a particular case. They are actually engaging the law and manipulating the law and twisting the law and making it come out as a certain result, whatever they want to see in society. So they're not lawmakers and they're not judges. They're actually dictators, because there's no one above them. They can do whatever they want, and they can say this is an interpretation when it's totally not an interpretation. They can say that's how we read it, and there's no one that can correct them on the bench because they are the Supreme Court. They're the highest court in the land. So this article says, this isn't textualism, it's ivory tower liberalism. And he's right. And it's completely at odds with the Supreme Court's longstanding dictum that Congress, in drafting statutes, won't inscribe a hidden meaning in otherwise plain language. As Justice Samuel Alito sharply notes in his dissent, the word sex in 1964 meant biological sex, man and woman, not orientation, and certainly not subjective identity, gender identity. The tangible results will be harrowing. Following Bostock, can a Catholic school deny employment to a teacher whose sexual lifestyle blatantly flouts millennia of Catholic moral teachings? Can an Orthodox Jewish day school refuse to hire a male teacher who self-identifies as a woman, contravening traditional teachings rooted in Genesis? Speaker Nancy Pelosi tried to enact much of this agenda legislatively in 2019 with the so-called Equality Act. So the House of Representatives, democratically majority-powered House of Representatives, tried to actually do this, basically rewriting the 1964 Title VII, and they failed. All it took was a Republican justice to impose it nationwide via judicial fiat. So this is a Republican justice. And this is the frustrating part, because as Christians, the whole plan was, okay, we want to reverse Roe v. Wade, and we want to interpret the Constitution as it was written. And we don't want to see these activist liberal judges legislating laws from the bench, because that's how they've done it. That's how the Roe v. Wade abortion decision was made. It wasn't passed in Congress. It was a Supreme Court decision imposed this on the nation. So it's a bypass. It's a way to get around the debate and argumentation that House of Representatives would have and the Senate would have. It's a way to bypass basically two branches of government and just go directly to the court and have these unelected lifetime appointees basically say whatever they want to say, and that controls the entire country. And so that's not right. It's a flaw in the system, if you want to put it that way. We almost need a court above the high court. But then again, you'd have to have a court above that higher court, and so on and so forth, infinite regress. So it's a problem. It's a flaw in our government system. The courts were never meant to legislate the law, and now they are doing it. And even the conservative who was appointed specifically for the purpose of not doing this, now he's doing it. So these justices, it's really hard. It must be really hard once you're appointed to the highest authority in the whole country to not get punch drunk with authority and power. And Gorsuch fell into that temptation. He is drunk on power. He feels he can rewrite words of civil rights legislation. He feels he can interject himself into the democratic process. He feels he can bypass the House and the Senate and the executive branch, and he can just directly change the laws as he sees fit. And he is part now of the liberal activist court. There's no question about it. And it doesn't do any good to say, well, he votes 80% with Clarence Thomas, the conservative. If those are smaller, lesser priority agenda decisions, yeah, he may do that. But we're talking about the big decisions, the social conservative priority list of things we want taken care of, and he has turned traitor on those. So it really doesn't matter what he does on these lesser things. It doesn't matter how he rules on taxation or this or that or other such issues. We care about these issues of life and death, and we care about these issues of basic morality. And Justice Gorsuch is totally failing us, and he's failing the president that appointed him. It says, religious employers' conscience rights aside, long-settled employment law has now been thrown into chaos by a conservative justice. The court concedes that such issues as sex-specific bathrooms, locker rooms, and sports teams will be on the chopping block in the future litigation. As my former boss, Judge James C. Ho of the Fifth Circuit, noted in a similar case last year, the underlying legal issues affecting every American who uses the restroom at any restaurant, buys clothes in any department store, or exercises at any gym. The substitution of subjective gender identity for embodied sex particularly threatens biological women, whose rights Congress specifically set out to protect in the 1964 Act. So this was a civil rights act from 1964 that specifically said that employers could not discriminate on the basis of sex. They could not discriminate on the basis of whether a person was a woman or whether a person was a male. So that is clearly understood, and everyone has understood it that way for decades. Now, the entire edifice of American anti-discrimination law, after all, rests on the principle that the bodily differences between men and women in athletic competition, in private or sensitive spaces, means something. Can that edifice survive if its cornerstone is removed? I don't see how. Bostock is no joke, this article says, and it lays bare the moral, intellectual bankruptcy of the conservative legal movement. Okay, now here we're getting into what I really want to say with this presentation, and that is that the conservative, social conservative legal movement has failed us, and we need to do something different. It's not enough that Trump gets a list from the Federalist Society if that list is flawed. Okay, let's say this is in the bluntest possible way. The conservative legal movement and its various institutional vessels, such as the Federalist Society, have failed conservatism. There's simply no avoiding that straightforward conclusion. Not when the blow is delivered from the Federalist Society vetted Neil Gorsuch. Yes, he was on the list. He was on the list that President Trump made public before the elections of 2016. He says, I'm going to pick one of these judges that the Federalist Society has recommended as solid conservative. They won't legislate from the bench. They won't be activist judges. They will interpret. They will not legislate. This is a solid list. And Christians looked at that and said, hey, that looks good. Because if the Federalist Society, those are people that know the inside outs of the legal system in this country, if they say that these guys are solid, we're going to give them thumbs up and we're going to vote for Trump. And the plan is that if he can put enough of these good, solid, conservative judges on the bench, we'll correct some of these profound mistakes that were made by the court, such as the Roe v. Wade 1973 decision legalizing abortion. And so that was the plan. And so it was working, supposedly. Trump nominates Neil Gorsuch, solid conservative from the Federalist Society list. And then Judge Brett Kavanaugh, solid conservative from the Federalist Society's list. Well, here we have our plan exploded when Neil Gorsuch reveals that he's not really a solid conservative at all. In fact, he's an activist liberal judge who's willing to legislate from the bench, who's willing to rewrite the laws and do everything the other liberals have been doing for decades, that we've been trying to get rid of that. Okay. The result is that the legal left makes loud arguments about justice and the good by its lights and triumphs, while the legal right mutters about textualism. Something more is needed to stop a progressive judicial revolution that would upend natural law, counter popular preferences, and further usurp the right of we the people to have our laws made in Congress by elected representatives. The conservative legal eagles have failed to deliver that. What we need is more forceful conservative legal movement, just as willing as the left to make moral arguments in court based on principles of justice, natural law, the rules embedded in our very nature as human beings, the common good, and religious and moral traditions underlying Anglo-American constitutional order. Otherwise, the conservative legal movement deserves to perish. So that's a great article by Josh Hammer in respect to this latest total collapse of the social conservative agenda by Neil Gorsuch, caving in to the liberals on the court, caving in to the power that he now holds to legislate laws instead of interpreting those laws. And so something definitely needs to be done different. Well, what is it that needs to be done different? Or what can be done different that we need to go ahead and correct at this point? How can we correct this? In other words, how do we change this? Well, I think there are a couple things that can be done. First of all, we have to forget about that list that the Federalist Society gives President Trump. I've heard that there's already that list. There was the list, the original one in 2016, and now Trump is still working off of that list. And I think what needs to happen is other more reliable social conservative legal scholars need to create a more narrow list. It can't be as broad as the Federalist Society is giving Trump in 2016. Because as we saw, Neil Gorsuch caved. Now that means that Neil Gorsuch is not a original intent in the way of Antonin Scalia. Okay, he's not that way. It's clear now. Now, some people say, well, you don't know what he's going to say on Roe v. Wade. No, we don't know exactly what he's going to say on Roe v. Wade, but we have our doubts now, and it's probably very likely that he would not overturn Roe v. Wade. Why? Because he's acting now as if he could, instead of looking at the Constitution and interpreting what is there, he's acting more like a liberal activist judge. And he's already shown that. So why would we have confidence in it? It's like when Lucy holds the football for Charlie Brown in the old cartoons. Every time Lucy says she'll hold the ball in place and Charlie Brown starts running toward the ball to kick it, she removes the ball and he falls flat on his back. And so the first time you might say, well, maybe she was just not doing right that one time, but I can trust her again. And yet every time, gullible, naive, Charlie Brown runs at that ball to kick it and Lucy pulls it out. Every time. So in other words, okay, Neil Gorsuch said he's going to hold the ball and conservatives are going to punt that thing over the field goal and he pulls the ball. So coming up to Roe v. Wade, do we trust this man? I say no, we don't trust him because he has shown himself to not be solid. He's shown himself to not be a true conservative original intent justice. And the Federalist Society gave Trump a bad list because he was on the list. So what we have to do is we have to have a more refined list. We have to have a better list. We have to have better scholarship. We have to have better researchers that vet these judges better. We need to not guess about this. We need to not just say, well, he seems to be leaning toward a more conservative. No, none of that. We have to give our president, Donald Trump, a good list of judges so that he can appoint solid conservatives. like a Clarence Thomas, like a Samuel Alito. He needs to be able to appoint those. And God willing, President Trump will have a second chance to get this right. Now, he was fooled, and so were Christians all over the country. We were fooled. We supported Gorsuch. We felt he was going to be a good guy for us, and he's proven us wrong. Face it. Let's be honest. He's proven us wrong on this decision, and it was a big decision. So this is the kind of decision we have the conservatives appointed for. These kind. The culture war decisions, the big ones. The little trivial things, the financial, all the other kinds of decisions Supreme Court justices make, not as important. But this is one of the big ones that we need these guys solid to make decisions, and he failed us. So what we have to do is we have to take that Federalist list. Maybe that's a good general list, and then we need to pare that down. We need to have another Christian society, legal society, or organization, or think tank, or individual scholars, or legal scholars. We need to look at the bigger list we're getting from the Federalist Society, the one that's not reliable. We need to pare that down and throw out these people like Gorsuch, who are not really deeply conservative and who will betray the cause whenever they feel necessary. We need to pare that down to get it down to a solid list of real conservative judges. Can't we do that? Isn't that possible? The Democrats and the liberals, they always seem to know who they're appointing. And those people who they appoint, they don't disappoint them. Why are we the only ones that get betrayed by our judges? Why are we the only ones that get sold a bill of goods? Because we're not doing our work thoroughly enough, and we're not willing to check into these people and vet them and say he's acceptable, he's not acceptable. And so we need to improve that process. And so maybe there's a legal society, Christian legal society, or more conservative legal societies that can do this hard work. But we need to give the presidents that we elect better qualified judges. And we need to be better at it. We just are getting beat. And there's no necessary reason for that. We have scholars, we have judges, we have strategists. We need to do a better job. And we need to pray that God, even through this messy process, will eventually reverse Roe v. Wade. Well, hope that's been a helpful commentary to you, and we'll see you back next week on another edition of Christ in Culture. God bless.